My boss fired me for being too costly after 18 years leading the engineering team. I was in his office on a Tuesday morning in March. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their familiar harsh glow across Derek Chen's mahogany desk. He had that smug look executives get when they think they've found easy money. The kind of expression that comes from staring at spreadsheets instead of understanding the systems that generate the numbers. The quarterly reports were spread across his desk like battle plans, each page highlighting red numbers in bold fonts, supposedly justifying what was about to happen. "We could bring in 3 junior engineers for your pay," he said, not even looking up from his laptop screen where he was probably reviewing the termination script HR had prepared. "Nothing personal, Mike, just budget cuts." I understood. "Thanks for the opportunity." That's all I said. Clean, professional. 2 sentences that carried 18 years of loyalty and dedication. I didn't argue or beg or point out the obvious flaws in his logic. I've seen men grovel in moments like this, and it never changes anything. It just makes the firing easier for them to sleep at night, gives them a story about how the employee didn't take it well or became emotional. 18 years. I started at Dataflow Systems when the office was half the size and occupied only the 2nd floor of this building. Back when the CEO, Robert Martinez, still knew everyone's name and asked about your family during coffee breaks. Back when we had company picnics instead of team optimization seminars and performance reviews that actually reviewed performance instead of cost per head ratios. I'd built their entire system architecture from scratch, not inherited it, not modified someone else's work. Built it. Every critical component, every failsafe, every workaround that kept their operations running smoothly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I designed it, coded it, tested it, and debugged it at 3 in the morning when nobody else would. Answer their phone. The payroll system that processed 847 employees every 2 weeks without a single calculation error in 5 years? Mine. The customer database that handled 12 million records and could execute complex queries in under 2 seconds? Mine. The backup protocols that had saved the company from 3 separate ransomware attacks, including the big one in 2021 that took down half our competitors? All mine. But cost-cutting had become the new religion around here. The management consultants had come through 6 months earlier with their leather portfolios and pristine spreadsheets, preaching efficiency through resource optimization. McKinsey types in $1,000 suits who'd never written a line of code in their lives, telling us how to run an engineering department. They spoke in buzzwords about right-sizing organizational overhead and leveraging junior talent scalability matrices. What they actually meant was firing expensive people and hoping cheaper ones could fill the gaps. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, clear as compiler warnings that everyone ignores until the system crashes. They'd been hiring fresh graduates at a quarter of my salary for the past 8 months, 22-year-olds straight from computer science programs, eager and cheap and completely clueless about production systems. Don't get me wrong, they were good kids with impressive GPAs and heads full of theoretical knowledge. They knew algorithms and data structures and could probably recite the principles of object-oriented design in their sleep. But they'd never dealt with a system crash at 3 a.m. when the CEO was breathing down everyone's neck. They'd never debugged legacy code written by someone who quit 10 years ago and left no documentation except cryptic comments like, "To do, fix this hack later." Most importantly, they'd never learned the hard lesson that every senior engineer knows: the difference between code that works and code that works reliably in production with real users and real data and real disasters. My boss, Derek Chen, VP of Operations, had been dropping hints for months. Comments about overhead costs during team meetings. Questions about whether certain processes could be streamlined by junior staff. Casual mentions of how much the company was spending on senior salaries versus junior ones, always phrased as innocent curiosity rather than veiled threats. I'd answered honestly every time. Some processes could be simplified, some couldn't. Experience isn't just accumulated knowledge. It's knowing which problems will kill you and which ones won't. It's understanding that the weird workaround in the authentication module that looks like bad coding is actually preventing a race condition that took me 6 months to identify and fix back in 2019. Derek didn't want to hear that. He wanted simple answers that fit his budget models. He wanted me to say that any competent programmer fresh out of college could maintain systems I'd spent years building and refining through trial and error and late-night emergency fixes. The termination meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. I know because I checked my Casio when I walked in and when I walked out, a habit from years of tracking billable hours on consulting projects back before I joined Dataflow. Derek had my severance package ready in a manila folder, obviously prepared well in advance. Standard corporate boilerplate, nothing generous. 2 weeks' pay and a promise to keep my health insurance for 60 days. 18 years of dedication reduced to a few photocopied forms and a security escort to clean out my desk. You understand this isn't about performance, Derek said as I stood to leave, his voice taking on that false sincerity that executives use when they want to sound compassionate about business decisions. Your work has always been solid. Exceptional, really. It's purely financial. I nodded. I understood perfectly. We'll have Kevin Martinez and Amanda Chen take over your responsibilities, he continued, naming 2 of the recent MIT graduates we'd hired in the past 6 months. They're both sharp kids, really sharp. They'll figure it out. Kevin and Amanda, 2 of the junior engineers I'd been mentoring since they started. Smart kids, no doubt about it. Kevin especially had that intuitive grasp of system architecture that you can't teach. But they've been asking me questions about basic system administration just last week. Questions like, why does the backup process run at 2:17 a.m. instead of 2 a.m.? And what's this weird table in the database that doesn't match our schema documentation? Now they were inheriting an infrastructure that had grown organically over nearly 2 decades, shaped by business requirements that changed quarterly, emergency fixes that became permanent solutions, and integration challenges with vendors who'd gone out of business or been acquired multiple times. They know where to find the documentation, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Derek smiled that confident corporate smile. Exactly. Everything's documented. Shouldn't be a problem. If only it were that simple. The walk from Derek's corner office to my desk felt surreal, like walking through a movie set of my own life. My colleagues watched from their cubicles, some pretending to work, others openly staring. The news had obviously spread quickly. Office gossip travels faster than network packets. A few offered awkward sympathy. "This is insane," whispered Sarah Rodriguez from accounting, a woman I'd helped set up her home Wi-Fi just last month. "They can't replace you." Tom Mitchell from marketing just shook his head, his face genuinely shocked. 18 years, man. That's real loyalty. But they could replace me, and they were. That's how corporate America works in the 21st century. Loyalty flows one direction until the spreadsheet says it doesn't make financial sense anymore. I packed 18 years of professional life into 2 cardboard boxes from the supply closet. Family photos from my desk, my daughter's graduation from high school, my wife and me at last year's company Christmas party, my daughter's drawing from when she was 8, still taped to my monitor after all these years, showing stick figures labeled Daddy and Computer holding hands, the coffee mug my team had given me for my 10th anniversary. World's most patient senior engineer in fading blue letters. A few technical books I'd referenced constantly, their pages marked with sticky notes and coffee stains from late-night problem-solving sessions. The personal items felt heavier than they should have. The security guard, Jim Morrison, who I'd talked baseball with for a decade, apologized under his breath as he escorted me out. We'd discussed the Red Sox's chances just yesterday morning while I was grabbing coffee from the break room. Now he was walking me to the parking garage like I was a security threat who might steal trade secrets or sabotage the systems I'd built. "Sorry about this, Mike," he muttered, his keys jangling with each step. "Just doing your job, Jim," I told him. That night, I sat in my home office and did something unexpected. Instead of feeling sorry for myself or calling my wife to vent about corporate betrayal, I started planning. Not revenge. I'm not that petty. And revenge is usually just self-sabotage with extra steps. But I began thinking strategically about what would happen next. I knew things they didn't know I knew. I understood systems they didn't understand. I had institutional knowledge that existed nowhere but in my head and in personal notes I'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades of problem solving. The documentation Derek had mentioned so confidently? It covered maybe 60% of the actual system functionality, and even that was optimistic. The rest was tribal knowledge, passed down through coffee conversations and crisis management sessions, stored in email threads and hastily scribbled notes that made sense at the time, but would be incomprehensible to anyone who hadn't lived through the context. For example, the production database had 17 different tables that weren't mentioned in the official schema documentation. Why? Because they'd been added during emergency fixes over the years, usually at 2 a.m. when a critical business process was failing, and updating documentation was the last thing on anyone's mind. The authentication system had 3 separate bypass mechanisms for different edge cases, all undocumented because they'd been implemented as temporary solutions that became permanent when the permanent solutions proved too complex or expensive. Most critically, the backup rotation system had a manual override that needed to be triggered every 90 days to prevent data corruption in the legacy accounting modules. This wasn't automated because the original vendor, Synapse Solutions, had gone out of business in 2019, and their replacement system couldn't interface properly with our legacy hardware without causing memory leaks that would crash the entire network. After about 6 weeks of operation, I was the only person who remembered to do this. I had a recurring calendar reminder that I'd never thought to share with anyone else because, well, I wasn't planning on leaving. They'd assumed this information would transfer smoothly to the junior team. They assumed 18 years of accumulated knowledge, battle-tested solutions, and hard-learned lessons could be handed over in a transition meeting or found in a wiki that hadn't been updated since 2021. It couldn't. Over the next few days, I organized my personal files with the methodical precision I'd learned from years of debugging complex systems, documentation I'd written over the years, system diagrams I'd sketched on napkins and later formalized, troubleshooting guides I'd created for my own reference. Everything I'd accumulated to help myself remember how things actually worked versus how they were supposed to work. Some of this information was on company servers, stored in folders with names like Mike's Notes and Emergency Procedures that no one else ever looked at. Most of it lived in my personal notes, my email archives, and my memory. The institutional knowledge that every long-term employee accumulates but rarely thinks to formalize until it's too late. I didn't delete anything from their systems. That would be sabotage, and I'm not that kind of person. But I also didn't volunteer to create a comprehensive handover document or schedule knowledge transfer sessions with Kevin and Amanda. They hadn't asked for either during the termination meeting, and I wasn't going to suggest it now. Derek had made it clear this was just business. So I'd treat it like business too. The first crack in their confidence appeared exactly 8 days after my termination. One of the junior engineers, Kevin Martinez, the MIT graduate with the impressive GPA, called me directly on my personal cell phone. There was panic in his voice. The kind you hear when someone realizes they're in way over their head and there's no safety net below them. The main server cluster was throwing errors he'd never seen before. The automated backup system was failing with cryptic messages about table locks and referential integrity violations. "The error logs don't make sense," he said, his voice tight with stress. "Something about table locks and referential integrity. But when I check the database schema, everything should work fine. The relationships all look correct." I knew exactly what was happening without even seeing the error messages. It was the quarterly maintenance routine interacting badly with the user session cleanup process. A timing issue I'd encountered back in 2018 and fixed with a delayed trigger that ran the processes in sequence instead of parallel. The fix had worked perfectly for years, but it depended on understanding why the processes conflicted in the first place. The solution was documented nowhere because it had seemed too minor to write up formally at the time. Just a quick fix that solved an annoying problem, the kind of small improvement that senior engineers make constantly without thinking to create official documentation for every single tweak. I didn't answer Kevin's call. I let it go to voicemail and listened to his increasingly frantic message later that evening while grading my daughter's math homework. The second call came an hour later from Sarah in accounting. "The payroll system is completely down," she said when I picked up, her usual calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Derek wants to know if you can talk to the new guys about fixing it. Payroll failures get executive attention quickly. Nothing motivates management like the possibility of not being able to pay employees on time." I called Sarah back that evening, after dinner with my family and after I'd had time to think about how I wanted to handle this situation. "Tell Derek he can reach me through my consulting company," I said, keeping my voice professional and friendly. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You started a consulting company? Filed the paperwork yesterday. MJR Technical Solutions. I'd named it after my initials, Michael James Richardson, and spent the afternoon setting up the basic legal structure and business bank account. Derek's not going to like this, she said. Derek made his choice when he decided I was too expensive as an employee. I'm making mine by charging market rates as a consultant. What are your rates? $200 per hour, 4-hour minimum. Another pause. That's a lot. It's competitive for emergency systems consulting. Supply and demand, Sarah. 3 weeks in, the calls became desperate. Derek himself started calling, first maintaining the corporate professionalism we'd used for 18 years, then with growing urgency as the problems compounded and cascaded through systems that were more interconnected than anyone had realized. I let most of his calls go to voicemail, partly because I was busy setting up my consulting business, but mostly because I wanted him to understand that I was no longer available at his convenience. The messages painted a clear picture. The junior team was drowning in problems they didn't understand. Projects were falling behind schedule, and clients were starting to complain about system reliability. Mike, it's Derek. Look, the Morrison Industries presentation is tomorrow morning, and the client portal is throwing authentication errors that Kevin can't figure out. He says it might be related to the session management system you designed. Can you give him a quick call? Just 5 minutes to point him in the right direction. Delete. Mike, Derek again. The backup system failed last night, and we can't figure out why. The vendor says everything looks normal on their end, but we're getting these weird corruption warnings. Amanda thinks it might be something in the legacy integration layer. Just need 15 minutes of your time here. Delete. Mike, this is getting serious. We've had 3 major system crashes in the past week, and I'm getting calls from Robert Martinez himself. I know we didn't part on the best terms, but we need your help here. The junior team is working around the clock, but they're missing something fundamental. Call me back. Delete. The 4th message was different. Derek's corporate confidence had cracked completely, replaced by something that sounded almost like genuine humility. Look, I know this is awkward, and I know I probably don't deserve your help after everything. But we need you to come in and walk the team through the server architecture. Just a day or 2 to get them oriented properly. We'll pay your consulting rate, whatever that is. I called him back within 10 minutes. $400 per hour, I said when he answered on the first ring. 2-day minimum. Paid in advance? He paused, and I could hear him calculating in his head what 2 days would cost versus what the system failures were already costing in lost productivity and client confidence. That's higher than what Sarah mentioned. Rates went up. Market forces. When you're the only person who understands a critical system and that system is failing, the market rate tends to increase. There was a long pause. I could hear keyboard clicks in the background, probably Derek running numbers on his calculator. We'll need to discuss this with finance, he said finally. You know where to find me? But Derek? I paused for effect. Emergency rates go up every day you wait, supply and demand. They didn't call back immediately. I figured they were trying to solve the problems internally first, probably bringing in other contractors or maybe even considering rebuilding parts of the system from scratch. Pride comes before the fall, as my grandfather used to say, and corporate pride is especially expensive. A week later, Derek called at 11:17 p.m. on a Friday night. I was in my home office working on a proposal for a potential new client when my phone rang. We lost the Morrison account, he said without preamble, his voice flat with exhaustion and defeat. The system crashed right in the middle of their quarterly review presentation. Completely crashed. Kevin couldn't get it back online for 3 hours, and by then Morrison had already called their backup vendor. Morrison Industries was their biggest client, representing about 40% of Dataflow's annual revenue. I'd personally managed their integration 3 years ago when they'd acquired 2 smaller companies and needed their databases merged seamlessly without losing historical data or breaking existing workflows. That's unfortunate, I said, keeping my voice neutral. The junior team has been working around the clock for 3 weeks, but they can't figure out what's causing the instability. It's like the whole system is falling apart piece by piece, and every fix they make just creates new problems. I knew what was happening, of course. The systems I'd built weren't just individual components. They were an ecosystem. Each part relied on others in ways that weren't immediately obvious, with dependencies and interactions that had evolved over years of incremental improvements and business requirement changes. Pull out the central architect who understood all these relationships, and the whole thing starts to collapse as edge cases and unusual conditions reveal themselves. "Can you come in tomorrow?" Derek asked, his voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard before. "We'll pay the $1,600 for 2 days. It's $1,600 per day, not total, plus expenses. And I'll need a formal contract stating that this is temporary consultation, not employment. I don't want any confusion about the relationship." Another pause, longer this time. "Fine. Can you start at 8 a.m.? I'll be there at 9. I don't do 8 a.m. anymore." Walking back into the data flow systems building felt strange, like visiting a house you used to live in. The same badge scanner at the entrance, though my old card didn't work anymore. The same fluorescent lights in the lobby. The same motivational posters about synergy and innovation that had been there for years. But everything had changed for me. I wasn't an employee anymore, subject to their policies and procedures. I was a contractor with an hourly rate and no emotional investment in their bottom line. The junior engineers looked exhausted. They'd clearly been working 16-hour days trying to patch problems they didn't fully understand, applying Band-Aid solutions that fixed immediate symptoms while creating new problems elsewhere in the system. Kevin had dark bags under his eyes and a desk covered in empty energy drink cans. Amanda looked like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Thank God you're here," Kevin said when he saw me walk into the engineering department. "This place has been a complete nightmare since you left." I spent the first hour just assessing the damage, reviewing error logs and system monitoring data to understand what they'd tried and where they'd gone wrong. Their solutions were logical from a textbook perspective, but showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the systems actually worked in practice. The authentication errors Derek had mentioned? They'd increased the timeout values, which fixed the immediate problem of users getting logged out unexpectedly, but caused memory leaks that were crashing the system under load. The backup failures? They'd switched to a different rotation schedule that avoided the immediate error messages, but was skipping critical databases that were only supposed to be backed up during specific maintenance windows. "Why didn't you just follow the documentation?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Kevin and Amanda exchanged glances, the look that employees share when they're about to admit something embarrassing. "The documentation doesn't match what's actually running," Amanda said quietly. "Half the modules aren't even mentioned in the official specs, and some of the processes described in the wiki don't exist anymore." Of course they didn't. The documentation had been written 3 years ago by a technical writer who'd interviewed me for a week and then tried to capture 18 years of system evolution in a 100-page manual. It was accurate for the basic functionality and the happy path scenarios, but it missed all the edge cases, the emergency fixes, the undocumented features that had accumulated over time like sedimentary layers. I spent 2 days fixing what should have taken me 2 hours when I still worked there. Not because I was slow-walking it to pad my bill, that's not who I am, but because I had to explain every step to engineers who didn't know the system's history and context. "Why is this module connected directly to the payroll database?" asked Kevin, watching me trace through a configuration file that looked like it had been written by someone having a caffeine-induced fever dream. "Legacy integration from 2018, I explained patiently. "When we merged the HR and finance systems after the Reynolds acquisition, I had to create a bridge protocol because the vendors promised a proper API integration but never delivered. This was supposed to be temporary. Where are the specifications for how it works?" I looked at him. "They should be in the company wiki under system integration projects." They weren't, of course. IT had streamlined the documentation system 6 months ago, archiving older files to save server space and reduce clutter. The specifications existed somewhere, buried in backup drives that no one remembered and directory structures that made sense to someone who no longer worked there. This conversation happened dozens of times over 2 days. Every fix required historical context that existed only in my memory. Every solution needed explanation of why things were done a certain way, usually because of business requirements or technical constraints that were no longer relevant but couldn't be changed without risking system stability. On day 2, Derek pulled me aside during lunch break. "How long would it take to get everything fully documented?" he asked, rubbing his temples in a gesture I'd seen a lot since I'd been back. "I mean really documented, so the team can maintain everything independently. I thought about it seriously, considering not just the documentation but the knowledge transfer process, the testing required to validate that the documentation was accurate, and the ongoing maintenance as systems continued to evolve. For someone who knows these systems inside and out, maybe 2 weeks of full-time work to document the critical processes and another month to cover the edge cases. For someone learning the systems as they go and trying to document them at the same time, months, maybe 6 months, maybe longer if they run into problems I've never seen before. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the numbers he'd been scribbling on a napkin. What would it cost to hire you back permanently? I'd been expecting this question since the moment he'd called me in for consulting. You can't hire me back, Derek. You fired me for being too expensive. If I'm worth more as a consultant than I was as an employee, that suggests the original decision was fundamentally flawed. People make mistakes. I made a mistake. People do make mistakes, but I've moved on. I'm building something different now. This was true. I'd filed all the paperwork for MJR Technical Solutions the week after my termination, and already had inquiries from 2 other companies who'd heard through industry networks that I was available for consulting. If businesses wanted my expertise, they could pay market rates for it. Derek's face went through several expressions: surprise, frustration, resignation, and finally something that might have been respect. What if we offered a significant raise, say 30% over your old salary, plus equity options? I did the math for him. Derek, you're paying me $400 an hour right now. That's about $800,000 annually if I worked full-time. My old salary was $120,000. The numbers hit him visibly. I could see him calculating what they'd actually given up, comparing the cost of my salary to the cost of system failures, lost clients, and emergency consulting fees. We obviously can't afford that long-term, he admitted. Then you can't afford to lose the expertise long-term. You wanted to optimize costs. This is what optimization looks like when you don't understand what you're optimizing away. I finished my consulting contract that afternoon and left professionally, with no burned bridges and no dramatic statements. I even wrote up a brief report outlining the most critical issues they'd need to address. Not everything. That would have taken weeks. But enough to keep them running for a while if they were careful. Over the next month, Derek called twice more for emergency consulting. Both times I helped at my standard rate, which had increased to $500 per hour as demand for my services grew. But I also started getting calls from other companies, referrals from colleagues, and word-of-mouth recommendations that spread through engineering networks faster than I'd expected. My first outside client was Meridian Manufacturing, a mid-sized company whose inventory management system was crashing every time they tried to process large orders. Their internal IT team had been struggling with the problem for months, throwing hardware upgrades and database optimization consultants at it without success. I diagnosed and fixed the issue in 4 hours. It was a classic database indexing problem, but they'd been treating it as a hardware limitation and trying to solve it by adding more servers in memory. How did you figure that out so quickly? Asked Marcus Torres, their CTO, a guy about my age who looked genuinely impressed and slightly embarrassed. Experience, I said simply. I've seen this exact pattern before. Your junior developers are talented, but they don't recognize the warning signs yet. They're trying to scale their way out of an efficiency problem. We've been trying to hire a senior database engineer for 8 months, he said. Everyone wants 6-figure salaries plus equity plus signing bonuses. You get what you pay for, I told him. Senior expertise costs more because it saves you more. They paid my invoice without question and asked me to put them on retainer for ongoing system optimization. Within 2 months, I had 3 regular clients paying me more than my old salary had been. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek had fired me to save money, but the market was telling me I was worth significantly more than what Dataflow had been paying. Classic supply and demand in action. My second client was Health Tech Solutions, a healthcare software company dealing with HIPAA compliance issues that were threatening their ability to operate. Their system was accidentally leaking patient data through a poorly configured API endpoint, the kind of problem that could result in massive fines and lawsuits. I spent a week with their team, not just fixing the immediate security vulnerability, but teaching them how to audit their entire code base for similar issues and implement proper security protocols. We've been trying to hire a senior security engineer for months, their CEO told me over lunch. The market is crazy competitive right now. Security expertise is expensive, I said, but data breaches are more expensive. Exactly. Your consulting fee is higher than what we budgeted for a full-time hire, but you solved in 1 week what we couldn't figure out in 6 months. The third client came through word of mouth. A fintech startup whose payment processing system was failing under load, causing transaction delays that were threatening their Series B funding round. Classic scalability issues that I'd dealt with dozens of times before, but their young team was panicking because their venture capitalists were threatening to pull funding if they couldn't demonstrate system stability. I fixed their architecture in 3 days and stayed on as an advisor for their funding presentation. They ended up raising $12 million, largely because they could finally demonstrate that their platform wouldn't collapse when transaction volume increased. The founder sent me a bottle of champagne and a handwritten thank you note. "You literally saved our company," it read. Meanwhile, Derek's calls continued sporadically throughout the summer. Always urgent, always apologetic, always desperate. The problems at Dataflow weren't getting better. They were getting worse as the junior team's fixes created new issues and the system's stability continued to deteriorate. 4 months after my termination, Derek called with a different tone entirely. Not panic this time, but resignation. "The board is asking questions," he said without preamble when I answered. "They want to know why our engineering costs have tripled since the budget optimization initiative." I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence is the most effective response. "We've had to hire 3 senior contractors just to keep things running," he continued. "They're charging us more per hour than your old salary was per week, and they don't understand our systems nearly as well as you did." "Market rates," I said simply. "Mike, I need to ask you something, and I need a completely straight answer. Is there any chance at all, that you'd consider coming back? Not at your old salary, I mean real money. Senior architect level with full authority over the engineering department." I'd been expecting this call for months, running through various scenarios in my head and thinking about how I'd respond. What's senior architect level pay at Dataflow these days? $180,000 base salary, plus equity options, plus a signing bonus to cover your lost consulting income during the transition back. 2 years ago, that offer would have seemed incredible. Now it felt almost insulting. "Derek, I'm making more in a month of consulting than I made in a quarter as your employee. And I'm working with companies that value my expertise instead of treating me like a cost center that needs to be optimized away." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing, processing the implications. "What would it actually take to get you back?" "It would take you understanding that experience has real value. That institutional knowledge isn't replaceable by documentation. That firing senior engineers to hire junior ones isn't optimization. It's a false economy that looks good on spreadsheets until reality hits." I get that now, I really do. Do you? Because I've got 3 companies paying me premium rates to help them avoid exactly the mistakes you made. The market has spoken, Derek. I was never the problem. That was the last time Derek called about hiring me back. But it wasn't the last time he called. 6 months later, I got a different kind of call from him. Not desperate this time. Not trying to solve an immediate crisis. Just wanting to talk. "I owe you an apology," he said. "Not just for firing you, but for how I did it. You deserved better after 18 years of loyalty." "I appreciate that, Derek. I learned something from this whole disaster. Those consultants who told us to cut senior staff costs, they were selling us a fantasy. You can't replace experience with enthusiasm, and you can't replace institutional knowledge with documentation. No, you can't." The new management team Robert brought in has a completely different philosophy. They're paying market rates to keep good people and hiring senior engineers at senior salaries. Revolutionary concept, right? We talked for 20 minutes. Derek sounded different, humbler, more thoughtful, less corporate. Getting demoted and watching his cost-cutting initiative blow up in his face had apparently taught him lessons that 18 years of success hadn't. "How's the consulting business?" he asked before we hung up. "Good, really good. I've got 6 regular clients now and a waiting list for new projects. I'm actually thinking about hiring my first employee." "Anyone I know?" I smiled. Actually, yes. Kevin Martinez contacted me last month. He's been looking for a new opportunity since Amanda left for Google. Kevin's a good kid. Smart. He is. And he learned a lot from the chaos after I left. Sometimes the best education comes from watching what happens when systems fail. Any regrets about leaving the corporate world? I thought about it seriously. None. I should have done this years ago. The only thing I regret is not realizing sooner that loyalty should be mutual. 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 Mutual.